All right, hey everybody, it's Chris Murphy. Thank you very much for joining another one of our Google Hangouts. This one is specifically focused on the issue of college affordability. I'm really pleased to have Miles Halpine and Emma Janger here from UConn and Yale, respectively, who are going to say a few words about some of the things that they're hearing about from their classmates and their friends about the issue of college affordability. But I kind of wanted to set the stage here. I'll talk to Emma and Miles, and then take some questions that have been submitted via Facebook and Twitter on the subject as well. So listen, this is one of the most important issues facing the country today for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, it's about the economic future and health of our country. My great-grandfather and grandfather worked at a ball-bearing factory in New Britain, Connecticut that doesn't exist any longer. Why? Because we've moved low-skill labor out of the United States, by and large, to developing countries. And what we're left with is an economy that can still flourish, but it's going to flourish because of the investments that we're making in high-skill labor and in technology and research and development. All of those fields need advanced degrees. All of those fields need very highly trained workers. That is why investment in education, especially in investment in higher education, matters more now than ever. The statistics tell us that we actually are going to have more job openings that require a college degree than we actually have college graduates 10 to 20 years from now. And so we're behind the curve. In the last 10 years or so, the United States went from the #1 country in the world with respect to the number of 25-year-olds, 35-year-olds with college degrees to number 12. For two reasons. One, the rest of the world is catching up to us. They're realizing that they need to make big investments in higher education to create more college graduates. They're doing that, but the United States is falling further behind because it's taking longer and longer for a lot of our kids to graduate because of the cost. But the second reason that we should really care about college affordability is because it's bankrupting our families. $25,000 is the average right now that a graduate comes out of school with respect to college debt. But there are so many families that are in the position that my family is in. I am still paying back my student loans, so is my wife, but we're also furiously saving for our kids' education. And so we pay on both ends. We both pay for past college and we pay for the cost of future college. Now, Kathy and I can afford to do that, but there are a lot of families that can't, and big portions of middle-class families' budgets in our state are being dedicated to paying back prior college and save for future college. That's money that's coming out of their pocket, money that's not going into the Main Street economy. And so as an issue of middle-class bread and butter economics, we have to care about the cost of higher education. And then, of course, the federal government right now is making a profit off of our higher education system. We have a college loan program at the federal level that makes $50 billion in profit in some years on the high end for the federal government. That doesn't make any sense either. So I've introduced some legislation that I'm going to talk about over the course of today's session that would start getting tough on colleges that are not serious about cost or quality. I'm working with Senator Warren on legislation that will allow graduates with loans existing today to refinance their student loans. I'm working with Senator Sanders and Senator Leahy on legislation that we just introduced today that will try to give college students some advanced credit for classes that they took in high school so that they can start a little bit ahead of the game. But we've got to have an obsession, a laser-like focus on this issue of college affordability. And as the youngest United States Senator, I think I've got a special obligation, a special responsibility to talk about this issue. So with that, let me just turn it over for a few minutes to Emma and then to Miles. I'd love for you guys to talk a little bit about what you're hearing on campus at Yale and UConn with respect to this issue about the affordability of college, the burden that kids are going to have when they graduate, and any ideas that you have on some of the things that we should be focusing here in Washington on ways in which we can help. So let me first turn it over to Emma.
Yeah, hi, I'm Emma, and I'm a rising senior at Yale. I'm president of College Dems of Connecticut. And one of the things I've been hearing a lot around campus, especially with my friends who are graduating this spring, is that because of loans and because of just the rising expense of college overall, they're sort of less willing to go into professions like teaching, like public service, like government work, because they're worried about loans, because they're worried about being able to maybe pay for a second graduate degree. And so even if they're able to get that degree, it's affecting what they're looking at, their career options being out of college. They're much more interested in things that are higher paying, even if it's not what they truly want to or what they think would actually make the country a better place. So I guess I was just wondering if you had any ideas for there are ways for legislation to sort of look at that aspect of it, certain careers where maybe loans were different interest rates would make more sense, or being able to reduce the burden of loans if they're doing something like government. Being in a situation where a senator still has loans and our country not being able to handle that seems a little ridiculous to both me and my friends, which are looking into hopefully going into similar lines of work.
You know, that point you made at the beginning about the burden of debt affecting career choice, is a real one. I sat down with a bunch of University of Connecticut medical students, actually now probably a couple of years ago, and there were maybe 15 med students around the table, and I asked them whether any of them were pursuing a career in primary care, which is where we really have a shortage of physicians. And one of the 15, these were first-year students, one of the 15 said they were even considering a career in primary care. And the real reason is that they had enormous student loans, medical students obviously have amongst the biggest student loans, and that they had to go into specialties like orthopedics and dermatology in order to earn the salaries necessary to pay back their loans. Not to say that we don't need really great, smart people in orthopedics and dermatology, but frankly, the real need is in primary care. And because that field didn't pay enough to pay back their student loans, they were going to fields that we didn't have as high a need in. And so this really has far-reaching consequences for our economy when you think about the choices that students have to make. Miles, you want to pitch in some thoughts?
Yeah, so I just want to thank you so much for doing this. Again, my name is Miles. I'm a rising junior at UConn, and I'm Communications Director for the College of Democrats of Connecticut. And so this issue, obviously it's very important, as you've been mentioning. You've been bringing up a lot of legislation that's very important to addressing this issue. And so specifically at UConn, it's a big concern for many of the students there. And so a few of my friends have been hearing about the different legislation that you've been supporting and introducing. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the College Affordability and Innovation Act versus the Bank on Students bill, which Senator Warren has introduced, which I know you're a co-sponsor of.
Yeah, thanks for the question, and thanks for your work. Both to Miles and Emma, you guys have done great work in giving students at Yale and UConn a voice on this issue. So the two bills, the one introduced by Senator Warren and myself and a bunch of others, my bill, which I've introduced with Senator Schatz, Senator Sanders, and Senator Murray, are totally compatible. Senator Warren's bill really speaks to college graduates. Her bill says if you have student loans, you should be able to refinance those loans down to a rate in the 3s. And I know that current students maybe aren't thinking about this issue in terms of what an interest rate will matter to you, but the difference between a 6.5% interest rate and a 3.5% interest rate, that is a pretty significant number. That's about $4,000 or $5,000 over the course of repayment. And so that's what her bill is really about. My bill is really much more operative on the colleges themselves, and my legislation says that we should hold schools to some standards when it comes to affordability and when it comes to outcomes. That schools, for instance, that have 30% of their students defaulting on their student loans, which means either that your product is unaffordable or that your product isn't good enough to allow students to get a job that allows them to pay back their loans, that if you have those kind of default rates, you shouldn't continue to qualify for federal student loans and for federal student aid. We give $1.6 billion out to one university system, a for-profit university system in California, where about half the kids don't show up for their second year. They can't even retain half their kids from year 1 to year 2. One of their degree programs is 10 times more expensive than the same degree program at a state university. They have about 30% of their kids who are defaulting on their student loans. But $1.6 billion of federal taxpayer money goes to this school, essentially to pad the pockets of their investors. It's a for-profit school. So, the two bills work in tandem together. They're certainly not mutually exclusive. Let me take a few questions. Thank you, Miles and Emma, for joining us here. Let me take a few questions from that we've gotten on Twitter and on Facebook. Here we have, and we ask for questions on a variety of topics. This is obviously our focus, but we're happy to take other questions as well. Here's an interesting one from Seth Malowitz on Facebook. He asks, will you look into supporting the removal of money in politics? And I think this is sort of a very relevant question to what we're talking about here, because for a long time, a lot of the banks ran our policy on student loans. We finally took our student loan program back from the banks and housed it internally, but in part because of the influence that a lot of the financial industry sector has had on politics, in part through their strategy of funding political campaigns. We were overcharging students for loans because we forced them to go through private banks, which saved students a lot of money by bringing this process back in-house. And when Congress gets distracted by issues important to special interests, rather than caring about interests that are central to middle-class families, like higher education, that's another advertisement for why we should care about campaign finance reform. So, Seth, I've been a big proponent of campaign finance reform. I think we should have a system by which federal candidates can raise a certain amount of private money and then qualify for a matching grant from a federal fund. If we did that, we would spend a lot more time worrying about issues like college affordability, because the special interest wouldn't have as much power here in Washington. So we've got a bunch of questions that are on other topics other than higher education. We'll take a few of these and then sign off and let people get back to their work days or school days. A couple questions on, okay, see you, Miles and Emma. Thank you guys. We're going to sign you guys off.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. Emily from Greenwich on Twitter says, what can be done about Metro North's atrocious service? So as you know all too well, for those people who live in Greenwich and Stamford, Stratford, and Milford along the Metro North line, big problems with reliability, especially since we've had these safety failures. Metro North has effectively slowed down their service in part to address some of the safety failures that they've had along the line. We are, Senator Blumenthal and I are meeting in the next week with the new leadership at MTA. We're going to be pressing them to make some internal changes to improve the reliability and the speed along the line. But ultimately, there shouldn't have to be a choice made between safety and reliability and speed. You should be able to run a railroad that is both safe and reliable. And we're going to continue to press Metro North on this issue. We've had a specific issue with the ability of these new M8 cars to function on the line. Part of what has slowed us up is that at any one given time, we have a lot of these new M8s that are not on the rails. And so we are also attempting to press the State Department of Transportation and Kawasaki, the maker of these M8 trains, to come up with a much better, much speedier plan to try to deal with the inadequacies of these trains. Take a couple other questions here. Let's see. Jason Morris says, why, after the natural gas industry spent over $700 million lobbying DC, do we now have an all-the-above approach to energy when the amount of possible wind energy available to the world is 5 times that of what we currently use? Fracking with its pollution to local aquifers is not a solution, but it is a source of profit and is going to continue to speed up climate change. Thank you for your question on this, Jason. Listen, I think we have to have a sensible policy when it comes to this explosion of natural gas capacity here in the United States. I don't think we can ignore this newfound source of energy, but I also think that we have to have controls to make sure that it doesn't pose an environmental hazard to communities. For instance, we should have tighter regulations about what kind of chemicals are used to extract this gas, and we should have greater controls on where it occurs. We shouldn't be doing fracking right next to public water supplies or in highly densely populated regions. That still leaves a decent amount of tight oil and tight gas to extract. To me, that is a common sense middle ground whereby we don't ban the practice of fracking writ large, but we be careful about how we do it and where we do it. The benefit to our economy is substantial. We can't ignore that. We also can't ignore the fact that in the short and medium run, we are not going to be able to build out wind power and solar power fast enough and quickly enough to completely eliminate some of our reliance on fossil fuels. And it's much better in that short and medium run to be able to rely on a domestically produced source like natural gas, which is both which both provides a national security benefit and an environmental benefit compared to relying on foreign-produced oil. So I think that there's a natural middle ground here that we should be able to find. Finally, I'll take a question from Joseph Mustich on Facebook from Washington. Why is NATO and the IMF destabilizing the Ukraine? There is a school of thought out there, and I have friends who share it in Connecticut who believe that the United States or that NATO has somehow precipitated the crisis in Ukraine. I don't share that view. I think the crisis in Ukraine is of Russia's making only. I do not subscribe to the view that the United States' stance on behalf of the ability of the Ukrainian people to grieve their government or on behalf of the ability of Ukraine to choose for themselves as to whether they want to join the EU or orient themselves towards Russia, somehow forced Russia to aggressively move on Crimea or eastern Ukraine. There are lots of countries across the world that make decisions that the United States does not like, and that does not provide a pretext for us to invade those countries. Now, lots of our allies say, well, that didn't stop you from invading Iraq. Well, I did not support the invasion of Iraq, and I don't think that one wrong justifies another wrong. Ultimately, though, there are substantial differences. Even though I didn't support the invasion of Iraq, we didn't design to permanently occupy and annex that country, as the Russians have done with Crimea. I went to Ukraine, and I stood in front of about 500,000 people who were protesting. I think that that was the right move for the American political leadership to show support for the Ukrainian people who were protesting their government in the face of violence from their government. The United States has always stood up for human rights and civil rights across the globe, and I think that we should continue to do that. Now our role is to try to economically stabilize Ukraine, and that's what I think the IMF is trying to do here, provide an economic lifeline to the Ukrainian government, to the Ukrainian people, so that they don't have to be continually reliant on a very dysfunctional relationship with Russia. And it is important for us now to send a clear signal to Russia that their actions in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine are not acceptable. I think it's time for the United States to start moving forward with sectoral sanctions against entire industries in Russia, because the consequences of letting this action in Russia go unpunished is not just about what happens within Ukraine, it's also about the signal that this sends to other countries as well. A country like China, which has shown recent aggression with respect to disputes over islands with neighboring countries, could all of a sudden feel that they can act with impunity on those claims in a military manner if they don't see Russia paying a substantial price for their military incursion into Crimea and now into eastern Ukraine. So this is not only an issue about Ukrainian sovereignty and the ability of Ukrainians to decide their future for themselves, but it's also about stabilizing, about the stability, the overall stability of the world as well. Listen, thank you everybody for joining us here. I'm sorry I got started a little bit late today on our Google Hangout. Thank you to Miles and Emma for joining us. We try to do this for little small blocks of time, a half an hour or 45 minutes whenever we can, to try to engage people on issues. We'll try to respond to folks that didn't get their questions answered here in other forums. Thank you very much, guys. Appreciate it.